I want to end today by talking about the case study of Syria. The civil war there is now in its second decade. Estimates of the amount of people killed by the war range from 300,000 to over 500,000 people. And it is now a war that has largely fallen out of the international media headlines, especially since the invasion of Ukraine a couple of months ago, but even going back to 2018, in which this article was published, that the world is largely forgetting about Syria in the same way that's forgotten about other costly civil conflicts like in Yemen and the Democratic Republic of Congo. And this conflict overlaps in large part with my academic career. I remember in the early days of the Arab Spring, when I was teaching in Louisiana, I would go on local television. I tried to find links to that, but I wasn't able to find any. The internet does forget, especially low-level media appearances by new academic professors like me, but that it is the conflict that's coincided with my academic career. When I taught the Introduction to International Relations at the ANU, I used a semester-long Syrian simulation in order to highlight the connections between theories of international relations and a specific current conflict, not really expecting the back when I was designing the class in 2016 that still the conflict would be going on conceivably long into the future, and now it is being used in this class as an example of the overlap between environmental stresses, migration, and conflict. And it's one that is of interest to, I know, some of the students in this class for your papers and your literature reviews. It also is of interest for policy. I mean, basically, there's so much going on with the Syrian conflict that you can connect it to almost any theoretical question you want to ask, even major power politics. And the Russian state and the United States have had a long tendentious relationship, and closest that their combat troops have ever gotten to each other since the end of the Cold War was in Syria, planes flying past each other in the Syrian airspace. Vladimir Putin using the U.S. presidential election as an opportunity to try to seek temporary advantage in Syria. Syria is a prototypical example of an internationalized civil conflict of the type that I talked about in week one, in which you have foreign actors playing a determinative role in the conditions of the war. That election is long over. The U.S. has a parliamentary election later on this year, congressional election. But there's a whole bunch of different reports. The Syrian Observatory for Human Rights, if you're writing a case study of Syria for your papers, would be a useful resource. They've been tracking and generating a lot of data and information about the conflict. This report from last week, on the 11th anniversary of the conflict, shows the continued destruction and ongoing situation in the war. At the same time, just within the last week, the efforts at trying to reach a negotiated settlement failed again in Geneva. I mean, there's been repeated efforts from 2017 to 2019 to 2020 to 21, 22 now of trying to reach a negotiated settlement. However, for the government of Syria, after Russia's efforts really stepped up, as well as after the U.S. withdrew a large amount of troops in a year or two ago, there's no real incentive to try to reach a negotiated settlement as the government slowly claws back territory, as well as slowly re-enters the political life of the rest of the world. Bashar al-Assad was locked up, unable to travel outside of his country for a while, except to Russia and Iran, two of his supporters, until this week, in which he made his first trip to the UAE. First trip to an Arab state since the start of the Syrian civil conflict. I'm sure this won't be the last one. He met with the owner of Manchester City football club, as well as the several of the heads in the of the UAE, and so you see this reintegration and normalization of widespread destruction and war crimes and huge civilian death toll within the country over the last decade. And so you have a whole bunch of different, I'm not going to get into this in detail, but you have a whole bunch of different groups, as well as civilians paying the cost, international actors getting involved, including US, UK, France, and Turkey. This report from last year from the Carter Center in coordination with Palantir and now with the ACLID data project shows the different zones of control, which over the time that I've taught this class has kind of seen the government areas wane and then wax and getting larger now, and you see the overlap of the Russian and the U.S. patrols in the north, which is a little bit concerning, and I'm sure there's coordination there. But you do see the violence continues in certain parts of the country, and you even have on the eastern part of the country, you have refugees from a previous war. So you had the Iraq War in 2003, you had the Syrian War in 2011, and you had Syria offering protection to Iraqi refugees in 2003, 70 to 100,000 Iraqis. By 2009, they estimated them as over 1 million. And they've been seen as potential supporters of the Assad regime. Some have stayed, some have returned after relative stability in Iraq, but then they've also been targeted as others have been in other contexts. So you see, even in war-torn areas, you see refugees from other conflicts getting caught up in the situation as well. So that is the background of the kind of major themes in the conflict so far: international intervention, large-scale migrant movements to Europe, as well as to other parts of the Middle East. I mean, most of the refugees, as we saw earlier, are in Turkey. And a lot of them are stressing the ability of countries like Jordan and Turkey to be able to provide for a lot of the refugees. A separate but related issue for the purposes of this class are the connections between environmental stresses and the causes of the war. And I think it's interesting to try to connect the theories that we covered in the class to the specific case studies, kind of like the Zhukov article talks about internal migration during that time period of the Gulag archipelago and try to maintain political control. Here, drought supposedly drove people to urban areas, which made them easier to mobilize or more likely to have lower opportunity costs to protest or to join the conflict. And so there's been a lot of research. I'm not going to make you read all of them. There's a lot of research that provides concrete evidence for the extent of the drought that Tom Friedman finds when he goes to that refugee camp over the border in Syria. And there's a lot of different ways of trying to use hard science measures in order to look at these environmental factors to try to determine the magnitude of the things that we have in our own lived experience compared to what's happened in previous years. This article looks at tree rings as a way to look at droughts in the Levant as well as in the Mediterranean region over the last millennium. And they went around and looked at tree rings in different areas around the Mediterranean, which you can see. And you can see the drought variability in these areas varied over time. And the places that were hard hit, I mean, all of them have been hard hit with droughts in recent decades as temperature has risen and rainfall becomes more variable. But the drought in Syria was the worst that it had been for 900 years, according to the tree rings and other research. And this has led to a debate in the literature. The strengths of the academic literature is you can take a step back and try to talk about the why with that and have other people weigh in on it in a dispassionate and academic approach. The Drawbacks, of course, as I mentioned earlier, is that it might not be as directly relevant to policymaking in 2022. But I wanted to highlight the fact that the academic debates are ongoing and they're real, and they're based on the discussions of the trends that we've talked about so far in this class. To what extent climate change has been a direct effect as opposed to an indirect precipitator of conflict through political or economic channels. And so this article by Selby et al. Kind of talk about the connections between climate change and the Syrian civil war, if you're interested. And then this led to this response by Colin Hendricks, who we've read before, talking about how the topic is important to understand, but a lot of the evidence, kind of like the Salehyan article talked about a couple of weeks ago, said that the direct effects are less concrete than how the background environmental stress characteristics can have interactive effects to people's lives that can lead to political change or economic change that could lead to violence. And of course, in the Arab Spring, you had different leaders making different decisions. In Egypt, Hosni Mubarak stood down after decades in power. In Tunisia, similar regime change as well, democratic elections seen as a success. In Syria, clampdown, complete repression, and a decade of war leading to the deaths of 500,000 civilians. And so you have climate stressors in similar contexts, but dramatic different decisions by political leaders, which kind of highlights how these background structural conditions can shape students' incentives, but also political leaders' incentives in these destination states. And so how those background conditions can create the possibility for triggers to be important to lead to war is something that we're still at an earlier stage. And I think for me, I'll end this week by asking my last lecture question for the week. And it's a larger question for this class in general. So please leave your answer on Waddle if you're taking the class. What are the policy-making implications of deciding that the drought did or did not contribute to the Syrian civil war? What policy implications are there for these theoretical links that we've talked about in this class? I want you to try to think about how we can link what we've learned from research and connect it to policy either at the domestic level or at the international level. And with that, that is the takeaway and what we'll keep coming to in subsequent weeks over the course of the class. I look forward to having more discussions about this in the workshop this week and after the teaching break. Thank you, and I hope you have a great day.